The dog hit the doors before the paramedics did. That was the first thing Sarah Voss noticed when the trauma bay swung open at 2:17 in the morning. Not the gurney, not the blood, not the two men in tactical gear shouting over each other about blood pressure and airway, and something about a collapsed lung. It was the dog. A Belgian Malinois, maybe 70 pounds, the color of dry sand and shadow, and he was already inside the room before anyone had cleared him to enter. He planted himself beside the gurney with his whole body rigid, ears pinned forward, and he did not make a sound. That was worse than growling. A dog that growls is warning you. A dog that goes silent has already made a decision. Sarah had been at CFB Petawawa's trauma center for 3 years. She had worked nights for all of them. She knew the sound of a medevac before it touched down, knew which orderlies moved fast and which ones moved carefully, knew the particular quality of quiet that meant something had gone wrong on the table. She did not know this dog, and this dog did not know her, and she could feel that fact like a current in the air as she pulled on gloves and moved toward the patient. "Ma'am." One of the men in tactical gear stepped sideways, not quite blocking her, but not quite not blocking her either. "Dog stays. I'm aware," Sarah said. "Who's the patient?" Nobody answered that. The two men exchanged a look that lasted half a second too long, and then the older one, broad across the shoulders, a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, said, "Warrant Officer James Calloway, JTF-2. That's all you need." JTF-2, Joint Task Force 2. Canada's Special Operations Unit, the kind of soldiers who did not officially exist in the places they had been. Sarah nodded and moved to the head of the gurney and did her job. Calloway was 38, according to the intake sheet someone had managed to fill out in the chaos. He had 2 broken ribs, a deep laceration along his left side that had been field-dressed with something that was not hospital gauze, a probable concussion, and a blood pressure that was doing things blood pressure was not supposed to do. He was conscious in the loose, unreliable way that suggested he was holding on to it through sheer stubbornness rather than any physiological reason. His eyes were open. He was watching the dog. The dog was watching Sarah. Every time she moved around the gurney to check the IV line, to reposition the oxygen monitor, to speak to the attending physician who arrived 6 minutes later, still pulling his coat on, the dog tracked her. Not aggressively, not yet. But with the kind of attention that had no casual explanation, he was cataloging her. She had the distinct and unsettling feeling that he was running some kind of internal calculus she was not privy to, and that the outcome of that calculus mattered. Dr. Reyes arrived and immediately looked at the dog and then at Sarah. "Why is there?" "He stays," Sarah said, before either of the tactical men could, because she had already decided it was easier that way. "He's not interfering. We'll work around him." Reyes looked like he wanted to argue. He looked at the dog's posture and decided against it. They stabilized Calloway over the next 40 minutes. It was not easy and it was not clean, but it worked. And when they finally had him in a bay with a proper monitor and a drip and his vitals moving in the right direction, Sarah stepped back and pulled off her gloves and let herself take one full breath. The dog was still there. He had moved once during the stabilization. When Reyes had needed to cut away the field dressing and Calloway had made a sound low in his throat, and Sarah had put her hand out without thinking, palm down, not reaching for the dog but offering the gesture, and the dog had stopped. He hadn't calmed down, but he had stopped. That was something. Now he was sitting at the foot of Calloway's bed, and he was looking at Sarah, and she had absolutely no idea what to do with that. The 2 tactical men had been joined by a third, a woman in a plain gray jacket who introduced herself only as Hendricks and produced a federal ID that Sarah was not given enough time to read properly. Hendricks pulled Sarah into the hallway and spoke in the particular low register of someone who had extensive practice not being overheard. Warrant Officer Calloway was extracted from an operation that experienced a significant compromise, Hendricks said. "We don't know yet whether the compromise originated in the field or closer to home. Until we know, the circle of trust is extremely small. That means everyone who has contact with Calloway in this facility is currently a person of interest." Sarah absorbed this. "You're telling me I'm a suspect. I'm telling you that right now everyone is." Hendricks's expression didn't change, "Including my own people. That's the situation. And the dog?" Something shifted in Hendricks's face, barely visible. Duke is Calloway's operational partner. He was with Calloway when the compromise happened. He's also. She paused in a way that felt deliberate, a remarkably good judge of character. Sarah looked back through the bay window at Duke, who was still watching the door she had walked through. What does that mean, practically? It means, Hendricks said, that if Duke doesn't trust you, you don't go back in that room. Sarah Voss had grown up in Trenton, Ontario, 20 minutes from the base that would eventually take up most of her adult life. Her father had been a loadmaster on CC-130s. Her mother had worked dispatch for the military police. She had learned early what it meant to live in the orbit of things you were not fully cleared to know, and she had never found it frightening, exactly. She found it clarifying. You learned to work with the information you had and not reach for the information you didn't. She had 3 brothers. 2 of them were still in. One of them wasn't, for reasons that had taken him 4 years and a great deal of difficulty to begin talking about. She understood, in the specific and unglamorous way of someone who had watched it up close, what it cost a person to carry something classified not just in their file but in their body. She also had, on the inside of her left wrist, a tattoo she had gotten when she was 24. It was small. It was not decorative in any conventional sense. It was 3 letters and a number in a font that looked almost but not quite like standard military stencil. TFK-97. Her brother Daniel had designed it. He had served with a JTF-2 dog handler unit for 6 years before a roadside device in an unspecified location had ended that particular chapter of his life. TFK-97 was the designation of his unit. Getting the tattoo had been her way of saying, without saying it out loud, that she remembered what he had given and that she did not intend to forget. She had explained this to approximately no one because it had never come up. It came up at 4:40 in the morning when she went back into Calloway's bay to check his pressure, and Duke, without any warning, stood up from his position at the foot of the bed and walked directly to her and pressed his nose against her left wrist. Sarah went very still. Duke pulled back. He looked up at her. His tail moved once, slowly, from side to side. Then he sat down at her feet. From the bed, Calloway said, in a voice that was rough with painkillers and exhaustion, "Huh." Sarah looked at him. He was watching her with the kind of focus that suggested the concussion had not entirely taken his faculties. "He doesn't do that," Calloway said. "Do what?" "Sit, for someone he doesn't know." He paused. "He also doesn't usually stop growling for someone he doesn't trust, but he stopped when you put your hand out in the trauma bay. He wasn't growling," Sarah said. "No," Calloway agreed. "That's the thing. He wasn't." She should have gone back to her rounds. She had 4 other patients on the floor, and Hendricks was somewhere in the building doing whatever federal investigators did at 5 in the morning, and the 2 tactical men were taking shifts in the hallway. She had no business standing in this bay, having this conversation. She stayed. "What's his background?" she asked, because it was easier than any of the other questions she had. Calloway took a moment that might have been the drugs or might have been him deciding something. 7 years. Started in tracking. Moved to personnel assessment at year 4. He reads people. That's the formal description. He reads threat indicators in human behavior. The informal description is that he knows things we can't quantify. And what does he know about me? Calloway looked at her for a long time. That's what I'm trying to figure out. At 6 in the morning, Hendricks came back with another agent, a younger man named Beaumont, who had the particular alertness of someone who had slept 4 hours and was running on professional obligation. They set up in a consultation room at the end of the hall and began what Hendricks described as routine interviews and what felt, to the 3 nurses and 2 orderlies who went through it before Sarah, like something considerably less routine. Sarah was scheduled for 7 a.m. She spent the intervening time doing her actual job and trying not to think about the way Duke had pressed his nose against her wrist like he was reading something written there. The interview was not hostile. Hendricks was professional in the way of someone who had long ago learned to remove personality from process. She asked about Sarah's background, her family, her time at the base, whether she had any connections to personnel who had recently rotated through theater. The question about family was where it happened. "Your brother," Hendricks said, glancing at something on the tablet in front of her. "Daniel Voss, former JTF-2 attached personnel." "Dog handling unit?" "Yes," Sarah said. TFK-97, yes. Hendricks looked up. "You have a tattoo?" "Yes." A silence that had a shape to it. Beaumont had stopped typing. I got it when he was medically released, Sarah said. He doesn't talk about it much. I wanted him to know that someone knew what he'd been part of. Hendricks set down the tablet. She looked at Sarah for a long moment with an expression that was not warmth exactly, but was something adjacent to it. Calloway served with TFK 7, she said. He was the handler lead when your brother was with the unit. The room was quiet. Sarah thought about Daniel sitting at her kitchen table in Trenton 2 winters ago, drinking tea he'd let go cold, not saying very much. She thought about the way he'd looked at her tattoo when she'd first shown him, like she'd handed him something he'd been searching for and didn't know how to hold. He never mentioned Calloway to me, she said carefully. He wouldn't. Hendricks said it without judgment. That's the job. The compromise, as Hendricks began carefully to explain it, had originated not in the field, but here. Someone with access to the medevac routing had flagged Calloway's incoming transfer to a party they should not have been in contact with. The list of people with that access was 23 names long. By morning, through methods Hendricks did not detail, it had been narrowed to 4. By mid-morning, through methods that Sarah gathered involved Duke's assessment of each person who had entered Calloway's proximity, it had been narrowed to 1. His name was Corporal Arsenault. He had worked logistics on the base for 11 years. He had, as Beaumont explained with the careful neutrality of someone reading facts aloud, recently acquired a financial relationship that did not correspond to his salary. He had also, the previous week, requested and received the medevac routing schedule for the coming month. Sarah was not in the room when they brought Arsenault in for questioning. She was down the hall, checking Calloway's vitals for the 4th time in 2 hours because that was her job and because it gave her a reason to be nearby. She heard, from the hallway, Arsenault's voice raised briefly and then not raised at all. She heard Hendricks's voice, level and unreadable. She heard Duke, through the wall of the bay, shift his weight and exhale. Calloway was watching her from the bed. His color was better. The drip had done its work, and the ribs were not going to kill him, and the concussion was resolving the way concussions resolved, which was slowly and without drama. "You knew," he said. "I didn't know anything," Sarah said. "About the unit. About your brother." He paused. He talked about his sister who was a nurse. He said she was the most stubborn person he'd ever met, and that was saying something given his professional context. Sarah adjusted his IV line, which did not need adjusting. "He said something similar about you." Calloway almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that took effort and meant something because of that. "He's all right?" Yeah, she said. "He's all right. He's got a dog now, actually. A retired shepherd from a training program. Named her after a place that doesn't officially exist." Calloway was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "That's good." Duke had moved at some point in the last hour from the foot of the bed to the space beside it, closer to Sarah's side. He was not leaning against her. He was simply positioned near her with the calm proprietary air of a dog who had decided something and was not interested in revisiting the decision. She reached down without looking and rested her hand briefly on the top of his head. He didn't move. Neither did she. At 11 that morning, Hendricks found Sarah in the break room, pouring coffee. She had no intention of actually drinking. She closed the door behind her and sat down across the table with the particular economy of motion of someone who had been awake for a very long time. "Arsenault has been detained," she said. "The investigation will take time, but the immediate threat to Calloway is resolved." "Good," Sarah said. "There are going to be additional interviews. Additional security presence on the floor for the duration of his recovery. I want to ask you." Hendricks stopped. Something in her posture shifted, and it was the first time Sarah had seen her do something that looked like recalibrating. "I want to ask if you're willing to remain his primary nurse for the duration. It would be easier, logistically." "Duke has indicated a preference." Sarah looked at her. "That's not standard procedure," she said. "No," Hendricks agreed. "Very little about this situation is." Sarah thought about Daniel's kitchen table silences. She thought about the tattoo on her wrist, which had started as a private gesture and had become, in the course of a single night, something with a history she hadn't known it had. She thought about a Belgian Malinois pressing his nose against her skin at 4:40 in the morning like he was reading her and deciding she was readable. "Yeah," she said. "I'll do it." Hendricks nodded once, the way people nod when they have already calculated the answer and are simply recording the confirmation. She stood, And then, in the doorway, she stopped. Duke chose your brother's unit designation, she said. That's not coincidence, and it's not nothing. That unit had a particular operational philosophy, that the mission includes the people around the mission, not just the operators. Everyone inside the circle. She left before Sarah could respond, which Sarah suspected was deliberate. Calloway was at CFB Petawawa's trauma center for 9 days. Duke spent those 9 days with a thoroughness that impressed even Hendricks, who did not impress easily. He learned the floor. He learned the shift patterns. He learned which orderlies moved with purpose and which ones hesitated, which visitors arrived with the right credentials and the right affect, and which ones produced paperwork that was technically correct but smelled, to Duke's assessment, wrong. He was not wrong once. Sarah had worked nights her whole career because she had never particularly wanted to do anything else. There was something about the quality of a hospital at 3 a.m., the stripped-down version of it, the way it became purely about what mattered, that suited her. She had never been able to explain this to people who did not already understand it, and she had long since stopped trying. She explained it to Calloway on the 4th night of his recovery, when he was well enough to be bored and she was doing paperwork at the small desk in the corner of his bay. Days have more noise, she said. Not bad noise. Just noise. At night it's quieter. You see what's actually there. Calloway considered this. Duke was asleep on the floor between them, his breathing steady and slow. That's what they trained Duke for, he said, essentially. Seeing what's actually there without the interference of what you're supposed to see. Did it work? Every time. He looked at the ceiling, not always in time, but every time. She didn't push on that. She knew the texture of that sentence. Daniel had said versions of it in the years after, when he was learning to live with the difference between those two things. On the 6th day, she called Daniel from the parking structure at the end of her shift. It was early morning, barely light, and she was tired in the specific way of a long night that had gone well, which was a different kind of tired from a night that had gone badly. He answered on the 3rd ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant the dog had already required a walk. You know a Calloway, she said, a long pause. Where are you calling from? Work. He's a patient. He's fine. Another pause shorter. Yeah, Daniel said. I know Calloway. He asked about you. She could hear him breathe. She could hear in the background the specific sound of a dog settling on a floor somewhere. He okay? Daniel said. He will be good. His voice had gone to that particular place it went when something mattered enough that he handled it carefully. That's good. His dog's here, she said. Duke, Duke. She could hear him smile, even over the distance and the bad reception of the parking structure. Duke's something else. He remembered your unit, she said. Or, I think he did. He found my tattoo. The silence on Daniel's end was the kind that meant he was working. She had learned to wait for it. That tattoo, he said finally. I never told you this. The designation. 7. That wasn't our unit number. What was it? It was the number of dogs we had over the whole deployment cycle. 7 of them. Different breeds, different ages, in and out. Duke was the last one. He paused. He was number 7. Sarah stood in the parking structure in the early morning light and said nothing for a moment. You never told me that, she said. No, Daniel said. I didn't tell you a lot of things. I know, but that one, he stopped. That one I should have told you. She looked at her wrist, the 3 letters and the number, small and quiet in the skin. It's all right, she said. I know now. On the 9th day, Calloway was cleared for transfer to a recovery facility. The security presence had reduced to 2 people, both of whom had been cleared through a process Sarah was not privy to and did not ask about. The investigation into Arsato was ongoing in ways that were not Sarah's business. She was doing the discharge paperwork at the nursing station when she heard the particular sound of claws on the linoleum floor, and she looked up, and Duke was standing in front of her. He had his lead attached, trailing behind him, which meant he had walked himself over here from the bay, which meant someone had either let him or failed to prevent him. His ears were forward. His posture was the careful, considered posture she had learned to read over 9 days as meaning he was doing something intentional. He sat down in front of her desk. He looked at her. Sarah set down her pen. Calloway appeared at the hallway entrance a moment later, moving slowly, in the deliberate way of a man with healing ribs. He slipped the handler, he said. I told them not to worry about it. He does that often? When he's decided something. Calloway stopped a few feet away. He's decided something. She looked at Duke. Duke looked at her with an expression that she had decided, over the past 9 days, could only be described as direct. I have his handler's contact information, Calloway said, for continued coordination during the investigation. There's a request from Hendricks and from the unit that you remain in the communication chain, informally, given your existing connections. Informally, Sarah said. That's the word she used. He paused. She also said, and I'm quoting here, that you had the right instincts in a situation that required them. Sarah looked at the tattoo on her wrist, the 3 letters and the number that turned out to be something different from what she'd thought and also exactly what she'd intended. Tell Hendricks thank you, she said. Calloway nodded. He looked at Duke, who had not moved. Duke. Duke stood. He walked back to Calloway's side and sat and looked back at Sarah once, with the deliberate quality of a dog who is making sure you understand that this is not the end of a thing, but the beginning of one. Then he looked forward, and Calloway moved, and they walked down the hall together toward the exit. Sarah watched them go. The hallway was quiet. The early morning light was coming in at the far window in the specific way it came in at this hour, low and pale and flat, turning everything it touched a little more real. She picked up her pen. She finished the paperwork.